History isn't a calm timeline of smart decisions. It's 44 real moments where logic lost, adults acted like children, and entire nations made choices that sound made up. This video is about true historical events so absurd they feel illegal, but still happened exactly as described. Just history embarrassing itself in public? 1. The 1904 Olympic Marathon in St. Louis was less of a professional race and more of a chaotic science experiment that escaped the lab. The organizers barely provided water in brutal heat, basically treating hydration like a character flaw. Runners choked on thick dust from support cars, stumbled into roadside snack breaks, and one guy even took an orchard nap like this was a picnic, not the Olympics. A Cuban runner showed up in boots and long pants, ate questionable fruit, felt awful, and still finished near the top, which tells you everything about the field. The first man across the line later got caught taking an 11-mile car ride, which is a bold strategy for a foot race. 2. Napoleon Bonaparte was a legendary conqueror who terrified almost every nation in Europe, but his most humiliating defeat came at the hands of a giant army of fluffy bunnies. To celebrate a new peace treaty, Napoleon wanted to have a fancy rabbit hunt, and his staff gathered thousands of rabbits for the event. The problem was that they bought tame farm rabbits instead of wild ones. When the cages were opened, instead of running away in fear, the rabbits saw Napoleon and thought it was finally dinner time. Thousands of bunnies charged at the emperor, swarming his legs and climbing up his jacket while he tried to beat them off with his riding whip. The most powerful man in the world was forced to run to his carriage in a blind panic while his generals tried to shoo away the fuzzy invaders with sticks. It is a hilarious reminder that even the greatest leaders can be humbled by a stampede of hungry pets who just want a carrot. 3. Australia is famous for having animals that want to kill you, but in 1932, the government decided to strike first against 20,000 emus. These giant, flightless birds were destroying wheat fields, so the military was sent in with Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The soldiers expected a massacre, but the emus turned out to be tactical geniuses. They broke into small groups and used their incredible speed to dodge fire, making it impossible for the gunners to get a clean shot. Major Meredith, the commander, lamented that his men were basically fighting feathered tanks that could soak up bullets and keep running like they were in an action movie. After a month of comical failure and burning through most of their ammo, the army retreated in shame, leaving the emus as the official winners of the Great Emu War. 4. President Andrew Jackson was a legendarily tough man who loved a good fight, but his best-kept secret was his pet parrot named Pole, who had a vocabulary that would make a sailor blush. Jackson spent his retirement teaching this bird the most creative and colorful curses he had picked up from years of military service. When the former president finally passed away in 1845, thousands of mourners gathered for a very serious and somber funeral at his home. However, Paul the parrot decided that this was the perfect time to show off everything he had learned. The bird started screaming a non-stop stream of profanities at the top of its lungs, shocking the grieving guests and the local priest. The swearing was so loud and persistent that the parrot actually had to be physically removed from the house so the funeral could continue in peace. It remains the only time in history a solemn memorial service was completely ruined by a bird with a dirty mouth. 5. The tiny country of Liechtenstein once participated in a war that ended up being more like a surprise friendship retreat than an actual military conflict. In 1866, they sent a grand total of 80 soldiers to guard a mountain pass and make sure nobody tried to invade their territory. While most armies are busy worrying about tactics and supplies, these guys were mostly just hanging out and enjoying the fresh mountain air and beautiful scenery while drinking wine. When the war finally ended and it was time to go home, the people back in the capital were shocked to see 81 men marching back into town. It turns out they had made a new friend along the way who decided he liked their company so much that he just joined the group and moved back with them. They are literally the only military force in history to go to war and return with more people than they started with because they were just too friendly to fight. 6. Tycho Brahe was a famous Danish astronomer who was incredibly smart, but also completely out of his mind when it came to his personal life and his choice of pets. He lived in a giant castle and kept a tame moose as a house pet that followed him around like a dog, and even attended dinner parties. The absurdity peaked when he brought the moose to a fancy social gathering at a neighbor's house to show off. Apparently, the moose managed to get into the beer supply and drank so much that it became completely intoxicated and started acting like a fool. The poor animal ended up stumbling around the host's mansion and eventually tumbled down a massive flight of stairs because it could not find its balance. Tycho had to explain to his high society friends why his moose was passed out on the floor. It is a wild reminder that even the most brilliant scientists in history had hobbies that involved getting large forest animals drunk at social events. 7. The War of the Bucket is the ultimate proof that humanity has always been incredibly petty and prone to overreacting over literally nothing. Back in 1325, some bored soldiers from the city of Modena decided to sneak into the rival city of Bologna just to steal a wooden bucket from a public well. You would think the people of Bologna would just go buy a new bucket at the local market, but instead, they decided to launch a full-scale military invasion to get their piece of wood back. 30,000 soldiers marched out to fight a massive battle, all because of a single bucket. Imagine being a soldier and having to tell your family that you are going to risk everything for a container that holds water. The best part is that Modena actually won the fight, and they still keep the stolen bucket on display in a tower today as a trophy. It is basically the world's most aggressive and lethal game of capture the flag. 8. The 1908 New York to Paris automobile race was a hilarious disaster that makes a comedy movie look like a documentary. 6 teams started in Times Square, but since there were almost no roads, they had to drive through deep snow and over frozen rivers. One team was so lost they tried to drive across the Pacific Ocean on a boat, while another was attacked by bandits in China. The German team was disqualified because they loaded their car onto a train for most of the trip across America. After months of being towed by horses and getting stuck in mud, the American team won, but they did not even realize the race was finished when they reached Paris. It was basically a worldwide demolition derby before traffic laws or paved roads were even a thing. They spent more time being pulled by cows than actually using their engines. 9. In 1726, a woman named Mary Toft managed to trick the top doctors in England, including the king's personal physician, into believing she was giving birth to actual rabbits. She claimed that she had been startled by a rabbit in a field and was now producing litters of bunnies on a regular basis. Believe it or not, the medical community took her seriously for weeks, and experts even traveled from London to watch the miracle happen. The hoax only fell apart when someone caught her husband sneaking baby rabbits into her room in the middle of the night. The doctors were so embarrassed by their own stupidity that they tried to bury the story. But the public never let them forget the time the greatest minds in medicine were outsmarted by a lady with a bag of bunnies. It remains one of the weirdest medical pranks to ever actually work on a global scale. 10. Emperor Caligula is legendary for being one of the most eccentric leaders in Roman history, and his declaration of war against the ocean is peak absurdity. In the year 40, he marched thousands of elite soldiers all the way to the northern coast of France to launch an invasion of Britain. However, when they arrived at the beach, he suddenly decided that his real enemy was Neptune, the god of the sea. He ordered his confused legionnaires to draw their swords and start stabbing the waves with everything they had. After the army finished attacking the water, he told them to collect seashells as spoils of war and plunder from the defeated ocean. He even built a giant monument on the shore to celebrate his crushing victory over the Atlantic. Imagine being a battle-hardened soldier and having to explain to your family that you spent the month fighting a puddle and filling your helmet with clams. 11. In 1618, a group of angry Protestants in Prague decided they were tired of some Catholic officials and decided to resolve the argument by throwing them out of a 70-foot-high window. This event is known as the Second Defenestration of Prague, and it was supposed to be a very messy execution. However, the officials did not meet their end on the pavement below because they landed in a massive, disgusting pile of horse manure that had been building up in the castle moat for years. The Catholic Church later claimed that angels had flown down and caught the men mid-air to save them, while the Protestants insisted it was just the massive pile of trash that broke their fall. Either way, These guys managed to survive a drop from a castle tower and walked away with nothing but a very bad smell and a story that sounds like a cartoon gag. 12. The ancient Egyptians loved cats so much that later writers claimed a Persian king figured out how to use that obsession like a cheat code. During the Battle of Pelusium in 525 BC, the story goes that Cambyses II had his soldiers paint cat imagery on their shields, and some accounts even suggest animals were brought near the front to rattle Egyptian morale. Whether fully true or polished over centuries, the legend captures a real human weakness. People hesitate when they think a sacred symbol is at risk. The result, at least in the story, was an army second-guessing itself at the worst possible moment. It is history's reminder that belief can be as powerful as any weapon, especially when it comes wrapped in whiskers. 13. Timothy Dexter was an American businessman who became rich the way a slot machine sometimes pays out just to confuse you. He understood trade about as well as a goldfish understands taxes, so his rivals fed him horrible advice for entertainment. They told him to ship warm bed covers to the Caribbean and send coal to a town that already had coal, expecting a public meltdown. Instead, pure luck and weird timing turned both into profits because the buyers found unexpected uses, and local shortages did the rest. He even staged a fake funeral to see who showed up, then popped back out alive just to review everyone's performance like it was an employee evaluation. He was basically walking proof that confidence plus randomness can look a lot like genius from far away. 14. In 1814, the city of London experienced a disaster that sounds like a college party gone horribly wrong, but it was actually a very sticky situation. A massive wooden vat at a local brewery burst open and released over 300,000 gallons of dark beer into the streets all at once. The force was so strong it knocked down the walls of several houses and created a tidal wave of booze that was 15 feet high. People were literally swimming through a river of beer while trying to save their belongings from the smelly and sticky flood. The weirdest part is that when the case went to court, the judge ruled that the whole thing was an act of God, and nobody was held responsible for the mess. The brewery eventually went bankrupt, but for one afternoon the streets of London were paved with free drinks and absolute chaos that proved that even beer can be a dangerous force. 15. In 1859, a man named Joshua Norton decided he was tired of being a regular citizen and declared himself Emperor of the United States. Instead of putting him in jail, the people of San Francisco absolutely loved the idea and treated him like actual royalty. He wore a fancy blue uniform with gold tassels, carried a saber, and printed his own currency, which local shops actually accepted as real money. Whenever he walked down the street, people would bow to him, and he even wrote letters to Queen Victoria giving her advice on how to run an empire. When he died, 30,000 people showed up for his funeral because they enjoyed having a pretend monarch living in their city. It is the only time in history a guy successfully promoted himself to emperor through sheer confidence and a really nice hat. Even the local dogs followed him around like a royal guard. 16. In the summer of 1518, the city of Strasbourg was hit by a literal dance fever that was far more terrifying than any modern music festival. It started when a woman named Frau Trophea stepped into the street and began to dance fervently for no apparent reason. Within a week, dozens of people had joined her, and soon hundreds were dancing through the streets until they were physically exhausted. They weren't having fun, they were begging to stop, but their bodies simply wouldn't obey. The city authorities decided the cure for too much dancing was actually more dancing, so they built a stage and hired musicians to keep the beat going. They thought the people just needed to get it out of their system. This remains one of the most bizarre cases of mass hysteria, where people literally could not stop moving until they collapsed from pure fatigue and exhaustion. 17. In the year 1900, the Olympic Games in Paris included some of the weirdest events that would never be allowed today, including a professional poodle clipping competition. 128 contestants gathered in a park to see who could shave the most fur off a group of poodles in the shortest amount of time. The winner was a lady named Avril Lafoule, who managed to clip 17 dogs in just 2 hours, which is an incredible pace for any groomer. It was considered a legitimate display of skill and athletic endurance at the time, but for some reason, the Olympic Committee decided that shaving pets did not really fit the spirit of the Games in the following years. It remains a hilarious reminder that the early Olympics were basically just a giant county fair where people could win medals for almost anything they felt like doing. 18. The Greek philosopher Diogenes was the ultimate historical troll who lived in a large clay jar and spent his days mocking the most famous thinkers of his time. When Plato told his students that a human being could be defined as a featherless biped, Diogenes decided to prove him wrong in the most annoying way possible. He went out, found a chicken, plucked every single feather off its body, and brought it into Plato's academy during a serious lecture. He held up the shivering bird and shouted to the crowd that he had brought them a man. Plato was so embarrassed that he had to change his definition to include having broad, flat nails. Diogenes was basically the original internet commenter who would travel across the city just to ruin someone's intellectual argument with a cheap, visual gag, and then walk away laughing at his own genius. 19. King Farooq of Egypt was a world leader with a very unusual and embarrassing hobby that made him a nightmare at fancy parties and international meetings. He was a professional pickpocket who actually took private lessons from a reformed street thief just to learn how to swipe items from people's pockets without them noticing. During the middle of World War II, he hosted a very serious dinner for Winston Churchill and managed to steal the British Prime Minister's expensive gold watch right off his person while they were talking about military strategy. Churchill eventually realized his watch was gone and got quite annoyed, so the king had to give it back and pretend it was all just a hilarious joke to lighten the mood. Farooq even went to the funeral of the Shah of Iran and stole some ceremonial swords from the grieving family. He was basically a high-stakes thief. 20. In 1763, the tiny village of Weinsberg in Germany pulled off the most disrespectful loophole in siege history. After a standoff, the winning commander promised the women they could leave with whatever they could carry. Everyone expected jewelry and food. Instead, the women marched out carrying their husbands on their backs like oversized luggage, forcing the commander to either break his word or admit he got played. He let them go, and the story became legendary proof that the fastest way to beat an army is to weaponize technicalities and teamwork. 21. In January 1919, Boston experienced the stickiest disaster in human history when a giant storage tank burst and sent a 2-million-gallon wave of molasses through the streets. This was not just a slow leak. It was a 25-foot-high wall of brown syrup moving at 35 miles per hour. It was literally fast enough to outrun a horse and strong enough to knock over entire buildings. The smell was so powerful that residents said the air smelled like a giant stack of pancakes for decades afterward. People were getting stuck in the streets like flies on flypaper, and rescue workers had to use salt water to wash the gooey mess away. It is the only time in history a breakfast topping became a terrifying natural disaster that shut down an entire city and left everything smelling like sugar for an entire generation. It was a sweet but very slow nightmare for everyone. 22. Peter the Great wanted Russia to look more like Western Europe, and he decided the quickest makeover was starting with everyone's face. He hated big beards so much that he personally chopped some of them off and then turned the whole thing into policy with a beard tax. If you insisted on keeping your whiskers, you paid a yearly fee and carried a special coin to prove your beard was officially licensed. Imagine needing government paperwork just to keep your own face the way it naturally grows. It was 1 part fashion reform, 1 part power move, and 100% the most aggressive barbershop energy ever seen in politics. 23. The last invasion of mainland Britain happened in 1797, and it was ended by a group of angry Welsh women wearing bright red shawls. A small force of French soldiers landed on the coast, but they were mostly interested in looting local farms for wine and food. When they saw a large group of women in traditional red outfits marching toward them, the French soldiers panicked because they thought they were being attacked by an elite regiment of British redcoats. The leader of the women, Jemima Nicholas, actually captured several French soldiers using nothing but a pitchfork and a lot of attitude. The entire invasion collapsed in less than 2 days because the French were too scared of the local ladies. It is the only time in history a military conquest was stopped by a fashion choice and a very grumpy grandmother who was not in the mood for guests. 24. When Thomas Jefferson became president in 1801, he received a gift that was so large it basically became a permanent and smelly part of the White House furniture. A group of farmers from Massachusetts wanted to show their support, so they spent an entire year making a single wheel of cheese that weighed over 1,200 pounds. It was called the mammoth cheese, and it was so big that they had to use a special wagon pulled by 6 horses just to deliver it. Jefferson kept the giant block of cheddar in the East Room for over a year and invited everyone in Washington to come by and take a slice whenever they wanted. The smell eventually became so intense that the staff had to beg him to get rid of the moldy mess. It remains the most delicious and bizarrely smelly political statement ever made in the history of the United States. 25. In 1835, a New York newspaper decided to pull off the greatest prank in history by claiming that a famous astronomer had found a civilization on the moon. They published detailed articles describing giant man-bats with wings, bipedal beavers that could walk on 2 legs, and blue goats living in crystal forests. The public was so hungry for weird news that they actually believed every single word of it for several weeks. People were gathering in the streets to debate how they could send missionaries to convert the moon people to their religions. Even when the newspaper finally admitted they made the whole thing up to sell more copies, most readers were not even mad because they enjoyed the story so much. It was the first time fake news went totally worldwide and proved that humans have always been willing to believe in moonbats if the story is told well. 26. Having a world record usually makes you a local hero, but for Hans Steininger, his claim to fame was the very thing that ended his life in 1567. Hans was the mayor of an Austrian town and was famous for having a beard that was nearly 5 feet long. He usually kept this massive mane rolled up in a velvet pouch so he could actually walk without tripping, but one day a fire broke out and caused a massive panic. In his hurry to escape the flames, Hans forgot to tuck his beard away, and he accidentally stepped right on his own facial hair while running down a flight of stairs. He lost his balance, tumbled all the way to the bottom, and broke his neck instantly. It is arguably the most embarrassing way to exit the world, especially since he was literally defeated by his own grooming habits. His famous beard is still on display in a local museum today. 27. Lord Byron was the ultimate bad boy of the 19th century, and he absolutely hated following the rules at Cambridge University. When he arrived at school, he was told that dogs were strictly forbidden in the dorms. Most people would just leave their pets at home, but Byron decided to find a brilliant loophole in the contract. He went out and bought a live bear instead, because the university rulebook did not technically mention anything about large forest predators. He would walk the bear around campus on a chain like it was a golden retriever, and even tried to apply for a fellowship for the animal, claiming it had better manners than the other students. The school officials were furious, but since there was no rule against bears, they could not do anything. It is the greatest example of winning a legal argument with a grizzly and proving that poets are just better at trolling the authorities. 28. In 1896, a man named William Crush decided that the best way to sell train tickets was to stage a massive head-on collision between 2 steam engines for fun. He built a temporary town in Texas called Crush and invited 40,000 people to watch the carnage like it was a giant festival. He even set up lemonade stands and carnival games for the families who showed up. When the 2 trains finally hit each other at top speed, the boilers exploded with the force of a bomb, sending shards of hot metal flying everywhere. Despite the chaos and the obvious danger, the event was considered a huge success because people back then were apparently desperate for any kind of entertainment. It was basically a demolition derby with giant trains before anyone realized that safety regulations were a good idea for public events. It was a literal train wreck of a party. 29. During the 13th century, Pope Gregory IX helped fuel a wave of suspicion around black cats by linking them to dark forces in official church messaging. People took the hint and started driving cats out or killing them, because nothing says problem solving like attacking the neighborhood pest control team. With fewer cats around, rats multiplied faster, and their fleas carried diseases that later devastated Europe. Historians argue about how direct the connection is, but the basic lesson lands either way. When fear makes people target symbols instead of reality, the consequences can get big fast. It is a grimly funny example of humans picking the wrong enemy and then acting shocked when nature sends the bill. 30. In 18th century France, people were absolutely convinced that potatoes were a biological weapon designed to give everyone leprosy, and they refused to eat them. A clever guy named Antoine Augustin Parmentier knew potatoes were a great source of food, so he came up with a genius psychological trick to change their minds. He planted a field of potatoes and hired heavily armed guards to watch them during the day, making people think the crop was incredibly valuable. At night, he told the guards to go home and leave the field completely unprotected. Naturally, the local peasants started sneaking in to steal the forbidden snacks because they thought they were worth a fortune. This one simple prank literally ended a famine and turned the potato into a national favorite. It proves that the best way to make people want something is to tell them they cannot have it. 31. Ancient Greek playwright Aeschylus was known as the father of tragedy, but his own death was the most ridiculous comedy ever recorded. According to historical accounts, an eagle was flying overhead carrying a large tortoise and looking for a hard rock to drop it on so the shell would crack open. The bird looked down and saw the bald head of Aeschylus, which was so shiny and smooth that it mistook it for a perfect stone. The eagle dropped the tortoise from a great height, hitting the poor man directly on the head and ending his life instantly. It is a terrifying lesson that even if you are the greatest writer of your generation, nature can still find a way to take you out with a flying reptile. His friends probably had a hard time explaining that one at the funeral because it sounds like a complete lie. It is the ultimate proof that gravity is the real enemy of the bald. 32. Most international wars are fought over land or gold, but in 1925, Greece and Bulgaria almost destroyed each other over a runaway pet. This event is known as the War of the Stray Dog, and it started when a Greek soldier's dog ran across the border into Bulgarian territory. The soldier chased after his pet, and the Bulgarian border guards, who were very on edge, opened fire on him. This led to a full-scale military invasion by the Greek army, who occupied several Bulgarian villages as revenge. It took a massive intervention from the League of Nations to stop the fighting and convince everyone that a border-crossing dog was not worth a global conflict. It is officially the only time in history a pet became a national security threat and caused an entire army to mobilize for a rescue mission. Luckily, the dog survived, but the diplomatic bill was quite high. 33. King Mithridates VI was so terrified of being poisoned by his enemies that he spent years taking tiny amounts of various toxins to build up a total immunity. He basically turned his own body into a laboratory of poison resistance. When he was finally defeated in battle and wanted to end his own life to avoid being captured, he took a massive dose of the strongest poison he had. However, his plan worked too well, and the poison did absolutely nothing to him because his immune system was too strong to be defeated. He was literally stuck in a situation where he was too healthy to die and had to ask one of his soldiers to finish the job with a sword. It is the ultimate historical irony that the very thing he did to save his life ended up being the thing that prevented him from having a quick and easy exit when he really needed it. 34. The War of Jenkins Ear sounds like a prank title, but it was a real conflict between Britain and Spain that got fueled by one extremely dramatic piece of evidence. In 1731, Spanish Coast Guards punished British Captain Robert Jenkins during an anti-smuggling incident, and Jenkins later presented his preserved ear to British politicians to prove how badly he had been treated. The shock value worked. Outrage spread, speeches got louder, and eventually Britain declared war, turning a personal grievance into an international mess. Imagine signing up for military service and realizing the emotional spark was a jar on a desk. It is the most literal example of "this is going to my representative" in history. 35. General Ambrose Burnside had a messy reputation as a Civil War commander, but his face ended up being his greatest legacy. He wore a strange style of facial hair that connected mustache to side whiskers while leaving the chin clean, and people started calling it Burnsides because humans love naming things after the guy who showed up first. Over time, the word flipped into sideburns, which is now just normal vocabulary, like we all agreed this needed to exist. It is hilarious that battles and strategy faded, but the weird haircut stayed. His biggest long-term victory was basically winning the language through pure commitment to a look. 36. Roman Emperor Commodus was so obsessed with being seen as a living legend that he decided he was basically Hercules in human form. He wore animal skins, posed with oversized clubs, and demanded everyone treat his cosplay like state policy. He also loved performing in the arena. But since he was the emperor, the matches were carefully arranged so he always looked unbeatable. Citizens paid to watch, the officials pretended this was normal, and nobody laughed out loud because that was a risky hobby in ancient Rome. It is one of history's clearest examples of what happens when unlimited power meets a fragile ego and an expensive costume budget. 37. The Nika riots. In 532 AD proved that sports fans have always been completely out of their minds. In ancient Constantinople, people were divided into two main groups of chariot racing fans called the Blues and the Greens. They hated each other with a passion, but when the Emperor Justinian refused to pardon some of their members, the rival fans decided to team up and burn down half the city. They spent an entire week screaming at the palace, setting fire to government buildings, and even trying to crown a new emperor, while the original one hid inside his room in a total panic. It is basically the largest and most destructive riot in history, and it all started because some guys in colored tunics were mad about a referee's decision at the racetrack. It took a massive military intervention to finally get everyone to stop yelling and go home. 38. The Battle of Karansebes. In 1788 is officially the dumbest moment in military history because the Austrian army managed to defeat itself before the enemy even showed up. It started when some cavalrymen bought barrels of schnapps and refused to share with the infantry. A massive brawl broke out. Someone shouted that the Turks were attacking, and the entire army panicked in the dark. Because the soldiers spoke different languages and could not understand each other, they started firing at their own shadows and comrades. By the time the actual Ottoman army arrived 2 days later, they found 10,000 dead or wounded Austrians and an empty city waiting for them. It is the only time a major battle was won by a hangover and a massive misunderstanding. The Austrian commanders were probably too embarrassed to even write the report. 39. During the French Revolutionary Wars in 1795, a group of French cavalrymen managed to achieve the most impossible naval victory in history by capturing an entire Dutch fleet. A massive cold snap had caused the sea around the Dutch coast to freeze solid, trapping 14 warships in a thick sheet of ice. The French hussars realized the ships were completely stuck and decided to launch a surprise attack on horseback. They wrapped the horses' hooves in cloth to muffle the sound and rode across the frozen ocean right up to the sides of the massive wooden ships. The Dutch sailors were so confused and terrified to see a bunch of horses surrounded by cannons that they surrendered their entire fleet without a single shot being fired. It remains the only time in history a group of guys on horses successfully conquered a navy on the open sea. 40. King Charles VI of France suffered from episodes of severe mental illness, and one of the strangest beliefs attributed to him was that he was made of glass. He feared shattering, avoided touch, and demanded special precautions, turning royal life into a constant anxiety routine. Courtiers had to manage a kingdom while also managing a king who could be sent into panic by ordinary movement in the room. It is not a joke situation for him personally, but it is a wildly surreal chapter of history that shows how fragile leadership can be when health collapses at the top. The glass delusion is remembered because it is such a vivid image of power mixed with fear, and it still sounds unreal even now. 41. During a massive siege in Germany in 1140, King Conrad III gave the women of the city a very generous deal to surrender and avoid a long fight. He told them they could leave the doomed city with whatever they could carry on their own backs, assuming they would just take some jewelry or a few nice blankets. Instead, the women opened the gates and walked out with their husbands strapped to their shoulders like giant human backpacks. The king was absolutely stunned by the loophole, but he actually kept his word and let the men go because he thought it was hilarious and clever. His advisors were furious and wanted to stop the procession, but the king insisted that a monarch should always be a man of his word even if he just got tricked by a group of ladies who literally carried the entire male population to safety on their backs. 42. Sigurd the Mighty won a battle, took a trophy, and then learned the hard way that trophies are not souvenirs you casually strap to a saddle. As the story goes, he carried his defeated enemy's head as a symbol of victory. But during the ride home, the rough movement caused a small scratch on Sigurd's leg. That minor wound later became infected, and the victorious warrior died days after winning. The irony is brutal. He survived the fight, then lost to a careless choice made afterward. If you want a historical life lesson in one sentence, it is this: celebrate the win, but do not turn it into a health hazard. 43. In the Middle Ages, people firmly believed that animals should be held to the same legal standards as humans, which led to some truly ridiculous court cases in the village square. In 1457, a sow and her 6 piglets were actually arrested and put on trial in France for being involved in a messy crime. They were given a real defense lawyer, and the whole town showed up to watch the proceedings with total seriousness. The lawyer actually did a great job and argued that while the mother pig was clearly guilty, the piglets were just young and impressionable and did not know any better. The judge actually agreed and let the piglets go with a warning, while the mother pig had to take the full blame for the situation. It is incredible to think that a group of highly educated men spent weeks arguing about the legal responsibility of a farm animal. 44. The Anglo-Zanzibar War holds the record for the absolute shortest military conflict in human history, and it lasted barely long enough to finish a cup of coffee. In 1896, a new sultan took over Zanzibar without getting permission from the British Empire, which was a huge mistake at the time. The British sent a very serious ultimatum, and when the deadline passed, they opened fire with their massive warships. The Sultan realized he messed up almost immediately and fled his palace while his soldiers stood around wondering if they were even supposed to be fighting. The entire war was over in about 38 minutes. Most people spend more time deciding what to eat for lunch than it took for this entire international conflict to start and finish. By the time the smoke cleared, the British were already looking for a new guy to put in charge of the island. After 44 real events like these, one thing is obvious. History is way stranger than fiction, and we clearly didn't learn enough from it. Now your turn. What ridiculous historical event did we miss that absolutely belongs in this list? Not a fun fact. A real moment that still makes you ask how humans survived. Drop it in the comments, hit like if history shocked you, and subscribe if you want more of it unfiltered.